I'm Walter Brooks. I'm the president of Seabrook Island Birders. Welcome. It's a pleasure to introduce Aaron Gibbon, who will be our speaker tonight. He is from Illinois and earned his Bachelor of Science in Zoology from Southern Illinois University in 2000. He's a young guy, but you know. Master of Science in Wildlife Biology from Southeast Missouri State University in 2005. Currently, he manages one of the largest birding stations in the Southeast, focusing on fall migration, wintering marsh sparrows, painted buntings, and Wilson's plovers. He does a lot of things. He's a statewide eBird reviewer for South Carolina, serves on the South Carolina Bird Records Committee, and is the second vice president of the Eastern Bird Banding Association. So where do you get the time? Yes. My pleasure to introduce Aaron Gibbon.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about painted buntings tonight, probably more than you may want to know. And I'll try to cut it off at a certain time. I tend to go a little bit. So if I start seeing people falling asleep, just kind of give me that thing and I'll speed it up. So this is a little bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Just a little bit of overview. We're going to talk a little bit about the life history of painted buntings, a little bit about the banding projects that I'm doing on Kiawah with them, a geolocator study, a Motus study, and a little bit more as well. So first thing we're going to talk about is just what does a painted bunting look like? Everybody seen a painted bunting before? Yeah. So how many people have them coming to their bird feeders? A lot. Okay. So we see on you got your adult male here on the left. That's, you know, your typical bird of what you're going to see for an adult male. You got the blue head and the red underneath and a kind of a lime green back. Sometimes it's got some pinks and purples and other shades of green mixed in. Your adult female here is on the middle. She looks a little bit more drab, but also just as beautiful, with kind of a yellow belly and a kind of a greenish back. And then you have your juvenile birds, which we'll start to see here real soon. And they look very similar to the female, as you can tell. There is one little difference, and you can kind of see in this picture, these juvenile painted buntings that we're going to start to see a lot of have these kind of buffy edges on their greater coverts here. And you can see that the adult female does not have those. Hers are all green. So once you start getting all the buntings coming to your bird feeders, you can actually tell how old they are by looking at some of these little things. And I'll not get into a lot of that stuff tonight. But I will point you in the right direction if you want to learn more about aging and sexing painted buntings on your own. So this is kind of a little graph I made of kind of the transition that a painted bunting goes through with its plumage. So the first group here, so this top row is going to be your female, your bottom row is going to be a male. And we're going to pretend that these birds here were hatched out, let's say right now. So we've got painted buntings in nests right now, and we're going to have fledglings here, if not already, really soon. So once they hatch out of their nest, they grow a set of feathers. These feathers are pretty poor quality. These feathers are made basically just to get them out of the nest. That's called their juvenile plumage, and they'll be in that plumage generally for a short period of time, between May and July, depending on when they fledge. So, and as soon as these birds fledge, they start to replace those feathers, but they don't replace all of those feathers. So that's what happens here in this next molt cycle that they do. It's called the supplemental molt, and that occurs in July and September. So you can kind of see this dark kind of green color here gets replaced by some head feathers and a little bit of feathers on their back. they'll get some new feathers here on their belly and a little bit here on their upper tail. But as you notice, this color here stays the same. So those are still juvenile feathers, which they do not replace those. Then they will actually molt again in September and August, and they will actually replace a few of these feathers on their upper wings. So you remember when I told you that the buffy wing bars on that first picture? So that would be in this plumage here and here. They retain those, but then in September, sometime in the late fall, they'll actually replace those buffy edged ones with those green edged ones. So later in the fall, you won't see that mark anymore, even though those birds might still be around. And then they're going to wear this plumage for the next year. They do, like a lot of birds that they'll have this alternate plumage, which is kind of happens in the spring. You know, when you see birds that dramatically change what they look like for the breeding season. Painted buntings don't really do that. They might replace a handful of feathers, but it's not enough to make it wasn't enough to make a box out of for the row here. So they'll go through an entire year and breed in this kind of plumage here. Notice they still have these juvenile flight feathers, which are the actual feathers that they use for flight. And then they will actually then go through at the end of 2020, it would be like the end of 2024, they would replace, and then they would molt all their feathers on their body, and they would become basically in their full of adult plumage. And so if you notice, female kind of they're going to look pretty much the same throughout that whole process. But the one difference comes here with the males. So that first year, you notice that the males are all green and look like females. So there's males that were hatched last year that are out right now, and they are green. They look just like a female. So they're like imposters right now. So that's called delayed plumage maturation. So there's some theories of why birds might do that, but one of them might be, so you got a really colorful bird. He's probably a pretty easy pick for predators. So why not masquerade around in a little bit more drab plumage during your first year, so you're maybe not as easy for prey for things. So these young males are out right now. They are singing. So if you see a green painted bunting singing, it's not a female, it's a young male. They're also breeding. They may be a little bit less territorial. So they might be a little bit more, so they maybe have multiple partners out there. It also allows these guys to sneak around, pretend like they're females. They can sneak into adult males' territories a little bit more because they're less noticeable, and they might be able to mate with his female and kind of move around a little bit more. So so if you want to learn a little bit more about like how to age these birds, I wrote a kind of an article on my blog a couple of years ago. If you want to take a picture of that screener, we can get it to you. If you go to that link right there, there's a whole detailed thing about how to age painted buntings, a little bit more detail. It explains what those feather groups are that I was kind of referring to a little bit more, but I didn't want to get too far into the weeds with molt in this talk. So all right, so where do painted buntings live? So there's two different populations. There's an eastern population. Those are the ones that are here, a little North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and into Florida. And then there's a western population, much larger, takes up most of Texas, Louisiana, up into Oklahoma, Missouri, or Arkansas, into Missouri a little bit. And there's even a population of painted buntings up here in Illinois along the Mississippi River. So these two populations are completely isolated from each other. There's really no mixing in between. And because of that, they have different strategies in what they do for migration. So all of our eastern painted buntings spend their winter in Florida, Cuba, and the Caribbean islands. And they don't go down to Mexico. All the western birds go to Mexico for the winter. And I'll get into a little bit of this little molt thing here later. Some of the research that we've done with some of the tracking stuff, I'll explain a little bit more about some of these patterns here. But that's kind of generally where these birds live, and they're making these shorter migrations to these other wintering areas. So this is a map produced by Cornell using eBird data, and this kind of shows a annual cycle of the painted buntings. We'll see if this. So you can see right now they're all in the wintering grounds. Come springtime, they flood up, and now we've got fall migration, and they're heading back down south. So you can notice. I'll play that. See if I can play that again. You can see how small relative our eastern population is to the western population. The western population is much larger. There's a heck of a lot more painted buntings out west than we have on the East Coast. But that pattern, that map that I showed you before with where they are, really kind of is solidified by this really cool map that all the eBird data points show. All right, so if the sound worked, I would have had an Aerosmith clip saying "Living on the Edge" right now, because that's where painted buntings like to live. So they like edge habitat. They like these places where you have, the mixing of two different habitats with, coastal scrub shrub habitat, where it's up against either some dunes, some more open habitat with some shrubby stuff, maritime forests where it's on the edge of maybe the salt marsh. They like agricultural areas as well, a little bit more inland where you have, fields within woodlots and things around it. So they like that area, that edge habitat. They do that on both breeding and non-breeding range. So what do painted buntings eat? So they eat a lot of different things. You might be thinking that they only eat seeds because that's what they're coming to your bird feeders for. But in fact, they do eat a lot of other things, especially during this time of year when they're breeding. So they'll eat a lot of insects. They'll feed their chicks insects, but they do eat mainly seeds. And in the wild, they're eating grass seeds, usually the small seeds. They're not eating like the real big types of seeds, but more fine seeds. This is like a foxtail species. We have a lot of giant foxtails that grow in different areas out here, and if you see those giant foxtails, especially coming in August and September, you're going to see painted buntings around those foxtails eating. And what they'll do is they'll jump on that seed head, and sometimes they'll ride it to the ground, and then they'll just kind of use it, then their weight of their body, which isn't a lot, to kind of help stand on it to pick those seeds off. And then obviously, if you want to attract painted buntings to your bird feeders, you can just put out some white millet, and they like that a lot. Vocalizations. So this also doesn't work, so I'm going to try something different here. So this is what a painted bunting sounds like. So this is what your males are going to be doing. So if you learn this song, you'll be able to find painted buntings. And then another call that they will do is an alarm call. And it's just kind of a flat chip, chip. And a lot of times you'll hear that, like the painted buntings that come to my bird feeders on James Island, where I live, before it actually comes to the bird feeder, I know, because it'll sit in the tree and it'll make this call a few times before it comes to the bird feeder. So I always know when the painted bunting coming to the feeder because I can hear it chipping. And then within a couple, like 4 or 5 chips, then it comes down to the bird feeder. So not sure why it's doing that, but maybe it's just people know. All right, so a little bit about the breeding ecology of painted bunting. So adult males usually arrive in early April. Females usually come a little about a week or so later. And that's generally because the males get here early so that they can find the best territories. They set up those territories, they start singing to try to attract those females when they come in. Most females do most of the work in painted bunting world. So the nests are built by females. They're usually low in the vegetation, 3 to 6 feet high, although there can be some that are much higher. Their eggs are kind of tiny little eggs. They're kind of a brownish with these dark speckles. So if you've ever seen a Carolina wren egg, it's a similar pattern. Tit mice also have a similar egg pattern as well. And they'll lay 3 or 4 eggs in the nest. Incubation lasts only 11 days. Females do all that as well. And the brooding also is done just by the females. So she'll sit on the eggs, she'll brood the eggs. And then once here's a cool video of a painted bunting getting fed at a nest by the female. And look at that big old thing. She's gonna feed that. So this was taken, about 15 years ago, there was a grad student named Sarah Latshaw who did some radio telemetry work on the island. And this was kind of part of her, my supervisor at the time. This was before I even got here. Took these videos of a bird. So that bird actually has a radio transmitter on it, which is how they found the nest. Put a radio transmitter on it, follow it around. The bird then leads you to their nest. So so it takes 11 days for them to sit on the eggs until they hatch. And then 9 or 10 more days later, those chicks have grown and they are out of the nest. So it doesn't take a long time to make a painted bunting. After that, the parents will take care of them outside the nest for 3 to 4 weeks, up to 3 to 4 weeks. So, they'll be with those chicks, helping, they'll be still begging for food. So they'll be feeding them a lot and kind of moving them around. That's also done mostly by the female. The males are still just out there singing their heads off, trying to make painted buntings. And sometimes the male will help, but if there is a nest that is done early in the season, they will potentially re-nest and have a second brood. Although I don't typically see that a lot with the banding work that I'm doing. I don't generally start catching young birds until the mid to end of July, which seems kind of strange because they get here in April. They could potentially have fledglings already by the end of May, but I don't catch them until the end of July usually. So I'm not really sure why that is, but I'm guessing most of these birds are having maybe just single broods every season. But and here's another cool little video. So you can look to see what that bird is taking. So I'll back up, see if we can do it. So that little one lifts its tail up, and that's the fecal sac. So what the female is doing is basically taking the poop right from the chick, and she'll fly off with it and drop it. That's to keep the nest clean, so that they're not pooping all over the nest. So when they're little like this, that fecal sac, it's kind of got a little membrane around it. So everything's in a little bundle, which allows them to take it off and drop it. All right, so this is we'll talk a little bit about painted bunting populations right now. So this is looking at large scale. So this data is from the Breeding Birds Survey, which is a survey, a large scale nationwide survey that is done. There's lots of different volunteers that go out and they do these what they call these point counts. And they have these specified routes that they do every year at a special time, at the same time, and they get this kind of consistent data from year to year. So from 1966 to 1996, in that time span, the breeding bird survey data showed painted buntings were really kind of decreasing in population. So the East Coast population is all in red, meaning that it was decreasing at a fairly good rate per year, as well as parts of the Western population. But should have changed. There we go. So then when we look at a little bit later, so this is the same data set just through 2010, things have started to change a little bit. So a lot of that red is now changing to different colors, which is a good sign. That means painted buntings actually are probably doing better in that time period. And then if we go a little bit further to 2013, we see a lot of blue in the Western population and a little bit of orange here or yellow here in the Eastern population. So we are seeing either a turnaround in the population. Painted buntings that were declining are now maybe increasing and across a lot of their range. And overall, it looks like in this time period that if you look at the entire thing, they're still decreasing by a little bit per year, and a little bit more in the southeastern coastal plain. But there are recent trends that are showing that their population is going up now, or at least stable in a lot of areas. And I'll actually show you some real data, local data that as well. So every summer I do a series of point counts, breeding bird counts basically, across Kiawah Island. I have 238 of these points that I go to every summer. I spend 5 minutes at each point, and I record every bird that I hear and see. And I also record the distance to that bird, which allows you to get what is called distance sampling. So it's you can use statistical means to get a density of birds. If you know where you're at and you know the distance to a bird, you can put some stats into it, and you can actually, instead of just knowing I saw X amount of painted buntings over this summer, we can actually get a density because we know the area that we surveyed and the amount of birds within that area. So this top graph here is just showing you raw numbers from my point counts from 2000. I can't read that. I can read it on here though. From 2008 to 2020. And you can see the top line is the abundance. So those are just the raw numbers. And you can see there is a general trend going up across from that time period. And then when you throw some stats on it, let me dismiss this, or maybe you can see that over that same period that Kiawah is actually seeing a 3% increase every year of painted buntings throughout that time. And that is just by going out and listening for birds in the summertime. If you I kind of also then take that data and I can look at it, go a little bit deeper into it. And what I did was I separated my point counts into these three categories, which say none, low, and high. And those are disturbance factors. So none is basically there's no development around that point. Low is about 50% undeveloped, or most of it is undeveloped, and then the high is most of it is developed. So I looked at all those points in those different categories, and I was able to define that in areas on Kiawah where there's very little development, we had a total of 755 acres of that, and our painted buntings were at a density of about 8.82 painted buntings per acre. And then you can do the math, and we could find that there's about 615 painted buntings in that zone on Kiawah. And then you look at the moderate developed areas, which we have a little bit more of that. Density goes down a little bit, but there's still a good number of painted buntings using that. And then if you look at the highly or the more densely developed areas, you can see we have a lot more of that compared to the other two. And the density has gone way down, but it actually produces even more painted buntings just because there's a lot more of it. But the quality of that habitat is probably less. And that's basically this graph here just squishes all of that into one. And we can basically say that we had about 2,303, that's an estimate, painted buntings that use Kiawah during the summertime. So that's about how many painted buntings we have on Kiawah. So a little bit about the conservation and management of these birds. So obviously habitat loss is probably one of the main things driving population size of painted buntings. Climate change and sea level rise is also going to play probably a pretty good factor in their population. You know, as sea level rises, you know, these, like I said, these birds like the edge habitat. So you know, it's going to affect a lot of these marsh edges and maybe the dunes in a lot of areas where these painted buntings like to be. So it could change the structure a little bit for them. Another thing is the illegal pet trade, which I'll talk a little bit about kind of a little bit later, or I could just do it now. But in certain areas, painted buntings are trapped and illegally, and they're sold to people for pets. The big, fairly large problem in Cuba. And you can see kind of, you know, there's got these cages, bunch of cages here with painted buntings in it. Birds here kind of, because you can kind of see they don't have any feathers here on their, that's from them trying to poke through the cages, and their feathers are kind of just rubbing off. So, but it's a fairly big problem. When I talk, so the next part of this presentation is about the tracking that we've been doing. We actually had a bird that I had ready to put a geolocator on, which is a type of like a tracker. And that bird was actually caught in Cuba by one of these trappers. And somebody was in Cuba, a birder. I'm not sure who this person was, but it got back to them that some trapper had caught a painted bunting with this weird device on its back. And she was able to track down that trapper. She gave him like, I think $5 or $10, and he gave her the tracking device, and we got that data. She sent it back to the Smithsonian, who was kind of in charge of all these things, and we were able to get that data back. And that was from a bird that I had put on here on Kiawah Island. So, and it's not the first time it's happened. It's you know, it's happened a few times with some of these birds. So, so some of, you know, obviously things that we can do to help protect these birds, you know, protect that edge habitat, encourage the use of native plants is always a no-brainer for anything. You know, maintain clean bird feeders. You know, sometimes these birds can get diseases from dirty bird feeders, and they can pass that on because multiple birds are coming to these feeders. So if a sick bird comes to your feeder, they leave that disease on there, another bird comes, and then that can kind of spread. So, and then obviously protecting against window strikes. I get calls every year about painted buntings that hit people's windows. Some of them are birds that I've banded, you know, that I'll have, you know, and there'll be a band on their leg. And so there's ways, if you have birds hitting windows frequently in a certain area, there's things that can be done to those windows, treatments, stickers, and different things to make that less a problem for birds. All right, so we're going to move into the banding part here now. So real quick, I won't dwell on this a lot, but these are kind of my major banding projects. I do some fall migration banding, which we catch a lot of painted buntings. I do a specific summer painted bunting banding where I go to people's houses who are already feeding them. I take their bird feeder down. I put my cage up like this. The birds go into these little holes that I have cut in the side. They go in to get the feed, and they can't figure out how to get out. So once the bird goes in, I'm usually watching it. I'll go and then get the bird out. So that's how I catch these birds. The other way is by mist nets, which is kind of hard to see on this screen, but there is a net right here, and these little dots right here are all yellow rump warblers that are in the net. And it's just a big 10, it's like a 40-foot long net, 10 feet high, really fine mesh. They fly, they can't really see it, so they're flying from one patch of cover to the other, and they just go into the net and they hang out there until we come by and take them out. We do some marsh sparrow banding. As in the wintertime, I do some winter songbird banding, and then also some Wilson's plover work as well. So with all these projects, to date, we've put on about 88,000 bands on birds just on Kiawah. We've had 24,000 recaptures, which means those are birds that were banded and then I recaught them after they had the band on. So that was the second time the bird was caught. Now that's not unique individuals. There's lots of birds out there I catch multiple times. Cardinals, you know, birds that live here, I might catch the same cardinal 20 times throughout a fall. So that kind of inflates that a little bit. And if I just pull painted buntings out, so to date, so this is as of July of this year, I've banded 4,201 painted buntings, and I've had over 2,500 recaptures of painted buntings as well. So with this work, I've found that adults have pretty high site fidelity, meaning that they come back to the same bird feeder year after year until they die, basically. And I found that juvenile birds don't do that. If I catch a juvenile bird at a bird feeder, I will not catch that juvenile at that same bird feeder the next year. But I might catch it at another bird feeder at a different part of the island, or I might not catch it at all. So, and obviously that's, you know, a young bird's not going to come back to where it was born. That's a genetics thing. They don't want to have to potentially mate with its mom down the road at some point. So, you know, they're going to spread themselves out a little bit. And the other thing that's just kind of interesting is feeders appear to be kind of neutral territory. So you may see some scuffling between birds at the bird feeder, but they kind of tolerate each other because they know that that's a food source that is always there and there's enough of it. So sometimes I'll go to a house and I might catch 10 adult males. Now they shouldn't all be coming into this area because they should have their own territories that they're defending, but they all come and eat off of this feeder within the same 2-hour period. So, and I'll sometimes catch multiple males at once. So, you know, if that one male was in another male's territory, he'd be fighting them to the death. But at this bird feeder, they're like, okay, we'll be friends for a little while. All right, so I'm going to jump into the geolocator study now. This study was done in collaboration with the Smithsonian Bird Center and a bunch of other partners, University of Oklahoma, University of Colorado, USGS, Cornell, Spring Island Land Trust, Bald Head Island Conservancy, Little St. Simon's Island, North Florida Land Trust, and South Carolina Audubon. So there's a lot of different partners involved. And basically, we were all basically catching painted buntings in the summer and putting these tracking devices, what are called geolocators. What these do is they measure light sensitivity. So they're not actually tracking the bird. They don't, but what it's doing is it's recording light levels. So it knows when it's light and then knows when it's dark. And based on that, we can use the sunset times and the sunrise times and get an idea of where that bird is on the map based on those light levels. So you know, it's not giving us like really pinpoint accuracy, but it'll tell us if a bird is in South Carolina or if it's in, you know, Florida. We'll know that difference, but we're not going to know if it's in Charleston or Seabrook Island. You know, so it's not that good. But the main goal of this study was to basically figure out where these birds are wintering. So for that, it did a really good job. So I won't go through all these numbers, but South Carolina had the most birds. We deployed by far the most of all the other, except for Oklahoma, who did a bunch as well. But Kiawah, this is what we did in Kiawah here. 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. I think I put out like 77 of these geolocators on Painted Buntings. We got a lot of them that returned. So we had 8, 6 more, another 8. So, you know, the goal is to get this data. I have to catch that bird of next year. So we have to be able to catch that same bird. It has to carry that transmitter on its back for an entire year. Then it has to go back in my feeder, my cage, and then I have to get it off. So that's the only way to get that information is to do that. So we were pretty successful here. We got a lot of birds that we recovered from. So we ended up being able to contribute a lot of good information and data to this study. So this is kind of what we found, remember that map that we showed early on basically kind of shows a very similar thing. So we'll start here with the Western population. So there were birds marked here in Oklahoma and in Arkansas. And all those birds that were marked here went to Mexico. And then all these birds that were marked here in the southeast, they all went to Florida, Caribbean, Cuba. There was no birds that went from here to here, no birds that went from here to here. One thing that we knew that kind of the birds did, but it was nice to kind of confirm it based on this tracking study, was the birds from Oklahoma did this little molt migration. So before they went to Mexico, they migrated over here to northwestern Mexico, and they molted their feathers. And then after they molted their feathers, they went down to the Yucatan. The birds in Arkansas did not do that. They went straight down to, and the main reason for that is because Oklahoma is a pretty arid place in the summer. Resources probably get scarce much earlier than they do in the forested area of Arkansas. So by late summer, these birds are out of there and they have to leave because there's no more food left. So it takes a lot of energy to replace all your feathers. So there's not enough food left in Oklahoma for them to do that. So they have to go on these little shorter migrations to areas where there's this is like the monsoon time for this area. So there's a lot more areas. There's a lot more food available for them. So they'll go there, they get to eat and gorge on whatever's happening there. They'll replace all those feathers, and then they'll continue on down to the Yucatan. So if we looked at just here at the eastern population, we got actually with this study, there are two different papers came out of this study. But this is kind of just boiling everything down basically to the nitty-gritty of these 2 papers. But so if we look at birds that were banded here or that were marked in South Carolina, I'm gonna put my glasses on. 27% of those birds spent the winter in North Florida. 32% of those birds spent their winter in South Florida. 12% spent their winter in the Caribbean, and another 28% went to Cuba. So when I was talking about Cuba and the legal bird trade, that's kind of got some implications, because if almost 30% of our birds are going to Cuba for the winter, that's a lot of birds that could potentially be being taken out of the population and sold as pets. So now if we look at those North Carolina birds, that changes a little bit. Very few birds from North Carolina went to Florida. Most of them, 60%, spent their winter in Cuba. Now the sample size for the North Carolina birds was a lot less. I think they only had like 5 or 6 birds that they marked. But still, a big percentage of those birds from North Carolina are going to Cuba. Similarly with Georgia birds, similar numbers to the South Carolina, but more birds from Georgia went to South Florida and the Caribbean, and we had less birds from Georgia going to Cuba and North Florida. And some of the birds that were marked in North Florida, they didn't really go very far. Some of them didn't go anywhere, it looks like. A quarter of them stayed in North Florida, but maybe just went a little further south. and then 30% went to the Caribbean, another 27% went to Cuba. So looking at all that as a whole, you know, there's most birds go to South Florida, a good chunk go to Cuba, and then another kind of group spends their winter in the Caribbean. Another thing this paper looked at was the estimated annual survival. And they basically found, I'm just doing the cliff notes here, but the annual survival within breeding regions were similar. So, but notably lower in North Carolina. So North Carolina birds had less birds return to, because we knew that because we had to catch these birds the second year. So less birds that were originally marked returned to North Carolina than these three. And they also found that the winter region probably affected annual survival a lot more than we thought. You know, we focus a lot on breeding habitat, and sometimes when birds migrate away from us, we kind of forget about that. But what happens on the wintering ground probably has a pretty big effect on the populations that we have here. So, so it's just something to note, looking at, and birds that wintered in Cuba had a much lower survival rate as well. And some of that probably goes back to the pet trade. All right, now I'm going to move over to the Motus study. This was a study that was done in collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and was funded by the town of Kiawah Island and the Carolina Bird Club. They helped both fund buying these transmitters and some of the equipment that we use to track this. So Motus is basically stands for, it's not an acronym. Motus is Latin for movement or motion. And what this wildlife tracking system does is there's a network of these automated radiotelemetry stations that are scattered throughout the world now. And what it does is it allows researchers to put these radio transmitters on these birds. And if the bird flies within a certain range of these stations, it basically pings these stations. And just because I have a station or two on Kiawah doesn't mean that just my birds will ping those. Anybody who has these tags will get pinged at these stations. So it's a big collaboration and everybody's sharing this data with each other. So it's really kind of a unique way to look at bird movements in a different way that we weren't able to do, you know, 5 or 10 years ago. So what these nanotags do, we call them nanotags, but they're essentially just a radio transmitter. They're very lightweight. They're all on a single radio frequency. So, so for instance, like we do some bobcat work. I'm sure you've heard a lot about our bobcat study that we do. It's all done with GPS tags now, but they still have the old school kind of that VHF in them. So each bobcat collar has its own frequency, but these bird tags all have the same frequency, which is what allows any station to pick up, because they're all tuned to the same frequency, all these different stations. But they have a code in them which allows you to basically get that individual bird then, so from these stations. They're somewhat programmable as well, but the one drawback is their battery life. It's pretty short, so you have to kind of time your deployment of these birds, of these tags. So generally they're going to last between 30 to maybe 75 to 80 days. We've had tags that have lasted longer, which you'll see here in a minute, which is kind of good when they do last a little bit longer. So for this study, we looked at, in 2019, we looked at one thing, and in 2020, we looked at a different kind of thing, all just on painted buntings. But in 2019, we focused on local movements. So what we ended up doing there is I put out 30 nanotags on 30 different painted buntings at 12 locations across Kiawah. I did that in early August, which is kind of the end of the breeding season for them. And the goal was to see if these birds left Kiawah to do, remember I talked about that molt migration that those Western birds did? So I was curious to see if these Eastern birds did something like that, but maybe more local, you know, that might not be picked up on a geolocator. So what I wanted to do, so what we ended up doing was we set up 5 Motus stations around Kiawah. We put one on top of the Sanctuary Hotel. We had one out at Captain Sam Spit. We had one at the other end of Kiawah, what we call Little Bear Island, which is just a little, there's nothing out there. We put one on top of the Osprey Point Clubhouse. And then we put one on one of our big kind of marsh overlooks, kind of out. So we tried to spread these stations out across the island. And we wanted to see basically are these birds moving out of the area? Are they moving, or are they getting detected from one tower, and then maybe getting detected out at a different tower? And then in 2020, we decided, based on the results from that, which I'll give it to you right now. They didn't really go anywhere. So, based on those results in 2020, we decided to just look at long distance movements after that. So we put out 34 more nanotags at 7 locations. We did that in September so we could just get their migration, their southbound migration. We took down 3 of those Motus stations because we didn't need them anymore. Sanctuary didn't want it on their roof for a very long time. So we were like, okay, it's only gonna be temporary, which that allowed them to let us put it up there. And we just had the 2 stations. So this is a short, 2-minute video. If you want to see it. If not, we can move on. But this is a question I always get, how you put these things on. So this is how we do it. So they wear it like a backpack. It basically just one loop goes up one leg. It goes around under the wings. The transmitter sits on its back. And then the other loop comes around and it goes on up on the other leg of the bird. My crochet hook and he's praying right now. He's like, please God, please. It might be a little uncomfortable at first, but they get used to it right away after a little while, and then it's they pretty much forget about it. Well, I don't, but the fact that we've observed these birds in the field doing normal painted bunting things very shortly afterwards, and they're not like trying to like peck at it or anything. They kind of go about their business pretty quickly afterwards. So all right, so after that, so now it's basically on that bird. And then what I'll do, which I'll cut those little extra loops off, and then I crimp down those are just crimp beads from making necklaces or bracelets. I crimp those down, and that keeps all of that stretch magic, that stretchy kind of bead cord that I use from slipping. And then off goes the bird, and he's collecting data for us. So this is kind of what the Motus infrastructure looks like. At each station, there's an antenna, usually 2 antennas, but sometimes more. It's got a box it's got all the computer guts. So it's got, the brains basically. And then some of them are powered by just plugging into, an outlet when we could. And then others that are in more remote areas are run by solar power. So this is kind of the current Motus network. So all those yellow dots represent those stations. So as you can see, we've got the Northeast is loaded with them. So doing migration research up there, you probably get a lot of information. It's getting a little bit less down here. But here in South Carolina, we've done a really good job. We've pretty much nailed down the entire coast of South Carolina. A bird cannot evade Motus stations in this state right now if it flies along the coast, because there's so many of them that have overlapping ranges right now. So we're working right now on getting the inland areas a little bit more populated, because all birds don't just migrate along the coast. they kind of moved that way too. So, so this is what it looked like in 2019. This is where we had our stations. And then in 2020, Little Bear, and then on top of the Timbers Resort building there. And that's where we have them currently still as well. We still have these two, even though I'm not currently doing putting out tags, but they're being used, you know, other people's birds are being detected at these. Yeah, you have a question? I will show you. So those are the ranges. So it's about 15 kilometers. So you're looking at, you know, 7-8 miles it can detect. That's when the bird has no obstructions. So the beauty of this is when birds are migrating at night, it's usually up high. So there's not going to be many obstructions. So when these birds are up in the air, it gets really good detection. So this tower at the Timbers, we actually have 3 antennas on it. And this one antenna that I have pointed inland can reach all the way past over to Wadmalaw, across Wadmalaw. So if a bird that's migrating like this potentially could get detected at that station there. So you can see all of Kiawah is, by these 2 towers, all of Kiawah is completely covered. So any bird flying over Kiawah is probably getting detected. And we've also got Seabrook covered as well, with the station here on Timbers. So, and this is the one over here on, I think this is Sullivan's Island, that's got one pointed out into the ocean and another one pointing inland. So, and then there's another one here, down at Botany Bay. So these are some of the preliminary results from this study. So in 2019, of those 30 birds that we had tagged, we got 2.5 million detections. There was no evidence of local movements, but we did learn about departure dates. So we knew when these birds left Kiawah for their southbound migration. In 2020, we got 1.6 million detections. We also got departure dates. We learned that there's some evidence that painted buntings probably make a little jump here from the Charleston area right across the ocean and maybe skip this little curve in our coast, and go across either down to Georgia or even Florida. And we also learned that there needs to be a lot more stations in Florida, to kind of learn a little bit more about when they actually stop, because we learned a little bit about how they go, but a lot of our detections quit in Florida, because there was just a lack of stations at that time in that area of Florida. So this is just one bird. Every one of those little dots is a detection, and this is only a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-day period. So can you tell when it's nighttime? So this is night here, and this is day. Basically, this is measuring the signal strength. So we know when these clusters of points are all together, the bird's not moving, because it's the signal is not moving as the bird is moving around. So we know that this bird this is the east, the antenna that's pointing in the easterly direction. So where that station might be, that's pointing east, this bird spent most of its time to the eastern side of that point of that station. And we can kind of look at how far this bird potentially moved, and when it moved throughout the day. This is that same bird. This is the entire season for this bird. All those green those green things is a detection. So, and this bird was detected at the Marsh Island Tower. Pretty much it spent its entire period at or around that tower. For whatever reason, it spent a few days feeding around the Osprey Point Clubhouse, and it left that area. It always came back at night, and then it never went back. And then we had Hurricane Dorian, which was kind of interesting. This was a station that ran on solar power, so it should have been working during the hurricane. But as you notice, it didn't do any detections during that time. So that bird could have been hunkered down, really bad, really to the point where it wasn't able to be detected, or it was so dark and cloudy that our solar power maybe quit working because it was a big battery which should have lasted a while being charged, but it's possible that maybe the solar just went down because of all the cloudiness, and the panel wasn't able to be charged. Then after that, but after that hurricane passed, the bird came, it was just popped right back up again. It spent the next several weeks, and then it left. And these little lines, different colors, represent different stations south of us. And I'll kind of just skip to what that looks like. So this is the same bird. So on the night of September 30th, it left Kiawah Island at 8:30. By 10:15, it hit Defusky Island. At 11 o'clock, it went by, I can't read that, Ossabaw Island. And then by midnight, it was down here at St. Below Island as well in Georgia. 12:30, hit St. Simon's Island. And at 1 a.m., it was in Brunswick, Georgia. So these are all locations where there were those Motus stations. So that bird went 145 miles. It traveled 4.5 hours to do it, and it averaged about 32 miles an hour, making that flight from Kiawah down to Brunswick. And then south of Brunswick, we didn't get another detection of that bird, so we don't know where it went from there. There's a little graphic for that. This is another bird that we marked. This bird, we got a lot of we didn't get as many detections, but we got some really neat stuff. So this bird, we'll start with, so fall migration are the points in yellow, winter is green, and spring migration is red. So this is one of those tags that lasted a lot longer than it should have. So this bird left Kiawah. You can't read that, but it left Kiawah on October 24th on 2020 at 7:45 p.m. It got detected at Harbor Island that same night at 8:30 p.m. And then we never heard from it again until November 20th. It was detected down at Florida Keys National Wildlife Refuge. And that bird spent the entire winter at that refuge, getting daily, pretty much nonstop detections throughout the entire winter, until April 1st. Now, and then it left Florida on April 1st, and we didn't hear from it again until April 23rd, when it hit a tower here in Jacksonville, Florida. And then that same night at 11:30, it was in Brunswick, Georgia again. 30 minutes later, it flew by St. Simon's Island. And then 2 days later, it popped up on the Deweese Island station. So it overflew Kiawah, and then spent the night on Deweese, or it was detected on Deweese at 4:45 a.m. So it presumably spent the entire day on Deweese feeding, and then it left Deweese at 10 o'clock that night, and then it was detected for the last time at 10:30 at the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. So this was a young bird. This was a juvenile, a hatchier bird, which makes sense that it probably didn't come back to Kiawah and to get detected here. So this bird got marked. It may have been hatched on Kiawah, may have not. We caught it there. We marked it. Spent the winter here in Florida, and it probably was then just looking for a new breeding territory somewhere local-ish. So looking at this kind of data, looking at departure dates, about the mid-October is about when these birds, that's the median time when these birds leave. We thought maybe there'd be something cool in there with age and sex. There wasn't. These birds pretty much kind of spread themselves out across the month of October. Even though even with those spreading it out, October 18th is still the median date. So if people ever ask you when the painted buntings leave, tell them mid-October. That's about when most of them leave. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is this new phenomenon of painted buntings here in the wintertime. So this is map of our area, and this is eBird detections in the winters of 2010 to 2011. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 years later, there were a lot more. 10 years later, there's a lot more. So now this could just be an artifact that there wasn't as many people eBirding back then. But there does tend to be an increase of painted buntings being found in the Charleston area here in the wintertime. So I decided to try to figure out why. So in the winter of 2021, 2022, I reached out to people who had painted buntings in the Charleston area that were coming to their bird feeders. We had a house here on Seabrook, one on Johns Island. We had a couple in West Ashley, James Island. I even went up to Goose Creek at a house up there. So I kind of wanted to spread it out a little bit and see. So I ended up color banding these birds. We ended up catching 27 of them, or I did. And each bird got a unique color combination of bands on their legs. And basically I was wanting to just know, I asked people just to kind of watch for these birds. I wanted to know when they left. I wanted to know if they stuck around for the summer. Are these birds, are they here year round? Are they residents, or do they leave and go someplace else in the summertime? So they did that. And we basically found that all those birds departed around mid-April. So they aren't resident birds. The birds that winter here are leaving and going someplace else to breed. I also found that many of these birds returned the following winter as well. So it's not like it was a one-off thing that these birds just happen to be wintering it, here. They're coming back to this same spot. We did have one bird that was seen outside of the winter season, which was kind of an interesting one. So this was a bird that I banded on Johns Island. This is Maybank here. This is like the McDonald's area right here. I banded that bird on February 23rd. At that time, it was just a green bird, so I didn't know if it was a male or female. And it ended up being resighted on the other side of Maybank over here at a house that I didn't band at, but somebody who just happened to see a bird with this jewelry on its legs. And that bird was then reported in June 12th, which indicates that bird probably was then breeding, wintered here, and was probably breeding somewhere over here. Then that bird was then resighted the next winter back over here, but not over here. And then that was the last sighting of it, was this last winter. And then on April 5th, the bird was then reported back over here. And they haven't seen it since April, which means that this bird potentially could have just been wintering in this area and decided it didn't breed here. So it's kind of baffling me right now. I really would have expected this bird to spend the entire summer here, but it didn't. So one thing about this bird was it ended up being a male. So when I banded it, it was a juvie. And then when it was found here in the last summer, it was a young male. Remember I talked about young males kind of roaming a little bit. And then when it came back the second winter, it was an adult, it had its adult male plumage. So maybe this year it ended up finding a new better territory. And when it was breeding last year up here, it just wasn't the greatest. And now that it's an adult male, it probably honed in maybe on some better quality habitat. All right, I think I'm done, guys. Thanks. Nobody fell asleep. That's amazing. All right, I'll take any questions you guys have. Yeah. 3 to 5 years is probably on average. I just caught a bird that so they do live longer. I think the oldest known painted bunting is 11 years old. And that's just because of banding data. I caught a adult female this summer at a house I've been banding at for a long time. And that bird was at least 9 years old. I banded her back in 2016 or 15. And at that time, she was an adult at that time. So then she was at least 2 years old. So she's at least 9. She could be older than that. We just don't know. Yeah. It's a good question. We don't really know why those mix. It probably just has to do with their evolutionary history. Those populations have been isolated probably for a long time, and they've just evolved these different migration strategies. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, males usually will arrive first in the spring. That's just so that they can get the best territories, and they'll start setting up that territory and defining their territory before the females get there, so that when the females come about a week later, they've already got their territory set up and they can kind of try to entice those females in. To keep them like longer in the season. No, they're hardwired to migrate. Providing food will keep them there. It's not going to prevent them from migrating away, though. When it's time for them to migrate, they're going to go no matter whether or not you have a full bird feeder or not. Well, so what happens a lot of times is I'll get around August time is when these birds start to molt their feathers. So I always get this, it's August, where do my painted buntings go? People always say. And they're still there, but what they're doing is they're molting their feathers. So they're a little bit more vulnerable at that time. So they tend to hang out a little bit, like they're more low key while they're doing this process. They might not be feeding on seeds as much. Maybe they need to get a little bit different. Maybe they're eating more insects because they need a little bit different diet to kind of get these feathers to come in. So, and then inevitably they return again once that molt, and they start to see a lot more birds again in September. A lot of times those are those young birds though, because they tend to dominate that September period with all these young birds, and the adults tend to leave right after they molt. So adults probably leave a little earlier than these younger birds. I think there was a hand up over here. I don't know that question. I don't know what a territory is. I should have gotten that information, but based on that radiotelemetry study that was done before I got here, I think they ended up learning a little bit about that. But they don't have huge territories. I can tell you that. It's, if you stand in one area, when I'm doing my breeding bird counts, I'll have several birds singing around me on territory. So my guess is that their territories are probably only maybe a few acres to, maybe 5 at most. Yes.
So what we saw here then.
Yes. No. Yeah, that was well, what'd you say that again? Yes. Yes, that is it. So yeah, there's two different populations, but yeah, there's the ones on the East Coast, and then there's the ones in the kind of that Texas area. And they're disjunct from each other. They're They don't mix. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, Craig.
Say you got up that, you know, and the male has full coat on here and
Okay.
so is that related to diet? Is that subject to change each year that birds?
I think that for one, I don't think people really understand it completely, but I believe it probably is more diet related. Because I do catch painted buntings that have these weird color patterns sometimes, like I've had males that, I've had a yellow underneath their tail when it should be red. And when these birds molt, they molt these feathers in different tracks. So like a bird's going to molt a portion of its head feathers at one time, and then it might move to another track. So when that bird is molting that tract of feathers, if it's eating something that can cause those pigments that it might be collecting in the food that might be different, it could be transferring that to that group of feathers, which is maybe why we're seeing those like that collar around the neck, or because it's not like when we see these birds like that, it's not sort of splotchy. It's usually confined to a certain portion of that bird. So I think that could be my best explanation of why. Yes. So I have a cage that I put up. So when I go to people's houses, they have a bird feeder already up. I'll take their bird feeder down. I have a cage that has 4 holes in the side, and I put a bird feeder inside my cage, and I hang that up right where their bird feeder was. So those birds are already used to coming to that spot. So when they come to my cage, they'll land on it, they'll hop around, and then eventually they'll find one of my holes. They go in and they eat, and that's how I catch them. I don't know yet. That's what I hope to figure out somehow. It could be climate change potentially. We're seeing temperatures increasing. It could be there's a lot more people feeding birds. Maybe these birds are finding these bird feeders in the wintertime, and once they survive and they find that area, they're like, well, that was good. Let's come back again next winter. So it could be a combination of those things. It could also just be that people are more aware now than they used to be. And we're just seeing them and detecting them more. So yeah, Judy.
Was he actually capable of breeding?
He was probably capable of breeding then. Yeah, once those birds, when they become basically 1 year of age, once they're hatched, they molt, they migrate south, they come back. Those birds, those males that are green at that point, they're ready to breed. Yeah. You had a question? Oh, was that it? That was maybe in one of my management things. So brown-headed, sorry about that. Brown-headed cowbirds it's a native species that we have here. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. And what that then happens is the eggs are usually bigger. Those chicks usually hatch a little bit before the painted bunting eggs. And when that happens, that cowbird chick will sometimes push the painted bunting eggs out of the nest, or if the painted bunting chicks hatch, they'll outcompete the painted buntings for food because they're bigger. And basically then the painted buntings are just raising a brown-headed cowbird. So an entire nest could potentially be gone. Painted buntings maybe not realize it because they haven't evolved with brown-headed cowbirds for a long time here on the east. So they haven't really realized how to recognize brown-headed cowbirds. So they just raise that cowbird chick thinking that it's their own. So it's cowbirds have been, in certain populations, cowbirds have been a real issue. Kirtland's warblers, if you're familiar with them, they're a formerly endangered species that bred in a very, very small area up in Michigan. And brown-headed cowbirds would parasitize those nests. And that was when their population got so small, they had to do management on brown-headed cowbirds. Basically, they trapped cowbirds and killed them in order to ensure that population of Kirtland's warblers could actually raise their own chicks. So they can have an impact on populations. There are some birds that have evolved with cowbirds and they learn to recognize cowbird eggs. Gray catbird is a really good example. They know a brown-headed cowbird egg, and if they see one, they will pop it out and get rid of it. So some birds don't know that. So yes. Well, in the United States, there is. When they find it, they do what they can. In Cuba, there's a lot less going on to curb that. It's illegal, I think, still in Cuba, but nobody's really doing a lot of enforcement. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you.